Hello, everyone. My name is Mason Goad. I'm a research fellow with the National Association of Scholars, a 501c3 that searches for truth, upholds the standards of liberal arts education, and fosters virtuous citizenship. Joining us today is Dr. J. Michael Waller, a senior analyst for strategy at the Center for Security Policy and the author of Big Intel: How the CIA and FBI went from Cold War heroes to deep state villains. I've known Dr. Waller for some time. He worked for the CIA in Latin America and did groundbreaking scholarship on the USSR after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and is often regarded as one of the premier counterintelligence experts in the country, having taught at some of America's elite institutions. So, Dr. Waller, thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be with you, Mason, with NAS.
So, one of the things that struck me about your book primarily was you talk a lot about education. I've done some research, as you know, on some of the Soviet influence, but you go into explicit detail with John Dewey and the National Education Association and so on. So can you just give us a little bit of a background as to what began in the subversion of the U.S. education system, and also explain why the people who are watching who are interested in national security policy should also take up an interest in education policy and vice versa?
It's pretty simple because the future depends on education.
Yeah.
And so how you shape future decision makers, future, in this case, intelligence analysts, law enforcement officers, comes through their education, K through 12, or their attitudes about their country, the founding of their country, the founding principles, Judeo-Christian ethics, family, everything else. Is it something they're going to treasure as they grow, or is it something they're going to hate?
Yeah.
So imagine then populating an intelligence community with people who don't even realize they've been shaped this way. So then they go into a university where it's really channeled into the different disciplines that they pursue, and then they come out the way so many of them come out, and then we get what we see.
Yeah. So back in the summer of 2022, I wrote an article for Newsweek about the ideology behind diversity, equity, and inclusion, which you touch on several times in your book. And in that article, I basically said that if the intelligence community had any sense whatsoever, they would stop hiring from a lot of these universities that you just mentioned. So, and I brought a quote in my notes here from a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania. She wrote, "The notion of freedom remains intertwined with whiteness. The belief that one is entitled to freedom is a key component of white supremacy." That was a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania, and that was published in the Washington Post. Right? These are some of our premier institutions, which has just gotten out of hand. And in your book, you propose this idea that the intelligence community should discredit colleges that are allowing this cultural Marxism to foster. So one of the questions, I suppose, is how do we actually get that idea turned into policy? Because if we can take back the federal administration, those are two very different areas of the federal executive branch, education and national security. So is there any cooperation between the two that we can see?
They're pushing the same agendas.
Yeah.
Whether it's cooperation, who knows? But it has become to a point where it's a great idea to come up and say the U.S. intelligence community should discredit universities that push cultural Marxism.
Yeah.
Who's going to do it when you have an intelligence community full of managers who embrace cultural Marxism?
Yeah.
So it's a real crisis we have.
Okay.
It can be done by presidential executive order.
Yeah.
But then what about the good students that are at those universities,
right,
who've seen through this? And then so many of the universities are contaminated like this. Well, where would our intelligence community go to find the good analysts?
Yeah, that's a problem. You mentioned, though, as to the analyst, I think a lot of people who have been up close with the CIA, as you have, know that it's almost two agencies. The operations side tends to not be nearly as bureaucratic and not nearly as woke, increasingly, as the analytics side. And So I think there's a case to be made for cutting back on the CIA. But what do you think needs to happen with the CIA in particular?
We need an intelligence service.
Yeah.
You see a lot of people getting so frustrated.
Right.
And they feel so hopeless that let's just defund the CIA. That's ridiculous. It's like saying defund the Army because it's just as woke as the CIA and the FBI. So it's a bureaucracy. We shouldn't be in awe of the three-letter brand that's the CIA. A lot of it deserves our respect, but a lot of it simply does not. But it's a bloated bureaucracy like any bureaucracy does. So you cut out the bloat by abolishing positions that are unnecessary. You can abolish entire units that are unnecessary. We don't need secret intelligence to spy on the climate.
Yeah.
We don't need an intelligence service to write reports on climate change. That's simply not what the CIA is for. So get rid of all of that and everything like it. We don't need gender units within the CIA. So for every DEI officer you have in the CIA, you don't have a supervisor in the clandestine service. That salary has to go from one pocket to another. So just cut all that out and cut out the real wasteful, useless, really absolutely useless. You talk to the policymakers, a lot of the CIA analytical products have no use. It's simplistic, lowest common denominator assessments that they're making. Get rid of that personnel. So abolish their positions, create something new on a real budget, and you force excellence out that way.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think that would shock a lot of outsiders is just how much of what the CIA does is open source intelligence, reading foreign news press and then putting that into reports and translating it, things of that nature, that really are not the secret super spies that Hollywood presents to them.
No, and we don't have many of those in the first place.
No, we don't.
So you have the reliance on technology and listening to people and intercepting their communications. That has value. But you have to have the human intelligence networks, that real clandestine service where you get to really know the people and the movers and shakers in the countries at hand.
Yeah.
And that means keeping people there for a long time, which is something that the CIA doesn't do because of the bureaucratic personnel system of constant rotation. Yeah. So I would downsize the CIA analytical side and split the agency into a separate clandestine service and then a separate intelligence collection and analysis service. Cut them both in half. Because, as you said, the ethos and the people within the clandestine service are generally much better than the ones in the analytical side.
That's been my experience. I'm sure it's been yours dealing with the agency. Going back, though, to the diversity, equity, and inclusion in the intelligence offices. Yesterday, and we're filming this on February 9th of 2024, yesterday, NSA Careers uploaded a video to their YouTube channel, and it was about employee resource groups. You mentioned in your book that you wanted to abolish them. In fact, to quote you directly, you stated, ERG cell groups in the intelligence services must be banned as unprofessional and as dangerous risks to compartmentation and morale. Now, the NSA, of course, in that video presented ERGs as these lovely little groups to get to know people. So what's the real truth about these organizations?
Well, first, ERGs, the CIA calls them ARGs, Agency Resource Groups. They serve no function for an intelligence service. They're social groups. They're grievance groups. They're like your little campus, lesbian students association or aggrieved person association or whatever else. So they can get together and complain and basically figure out ways to use diversity, equity, and inclusion as a means to get themselves promoted through the system and not on merit. Yeah. And that's all it is. So they're cell groups.
Yeah. So it's funny you bring that up, though, because the focus of the talk yesterday, NSA Careers, they discussed how these ERGs at NSA had actually created a system to notify them specifically of new job postings, and how that was allowing them to advance their careers not based on merit but based on their complaints to the NSA administrators. that they weren't being notified of job postings and of that sort, and they had preferential treatment through this complaint, and then the program they set up to address that complaint.
That's all it's designed for. You want the best people in the job, especially in intelligence. So you're not getting them with these. Now, it's funny because yesterday also the FBI sent out notices in its field offices that it put up on X for the same thing, celebrating employee resource groups.
Yeah. So these things need to go. They have to be.
They serve no purpose.
Yeah.
They're undermining the integrity of intelligence. If you're undermining the quality of what's collected, and you're undermining the quality of what's analyzed, and you're putting incompetents out in the field who can't do their jobs, why would they be in there in the first place?
Yeah.
Or put them where they fit the best?
Well, perhaps they do serve a purpose, though. They find people who have vested interest in identity politics and promotion of identity politics above merit, and then allow them to network in social groups and bring their influence to weight against the administrators of these agencies.
Right. They're subverting our intelligence community from within.
It's almost a politicization without the political parties present. Yeah. So we've talked about the CIA and NSA and our universities, but there's probably a lot of people who are watching, parents in particular, who and good law enforcement agencies out there as well, both local and state, who have become quite concerned about the FBI. You mentioned in your book and about what happened a few years ago in Loudoun, where these parents, because of the COVID lockdowns, they got a glimpse into what was happening in their K through 12 schools. And they saw these radical materials and sometimes pornographic materials for the first time, that they had not been privy to this information before because their children were going off to their classes, and now they were on Zoom and got to see it. And when they took these grievances, the well-founded grievances, to their local school board, the FBI was sicked on them. So what is going on with America's chief cops? They have this image of being the good guys. They've held it for a long time, but that's no longer the case. So what's happened there?
Why are the feds involved in any actions of a local nature on a county school board?
Yeah.
It's not a federal issue.
No, and they're not federal criminals either.
No,
Parents.
But any parent would has a right to be angry if they find that their elected school board members are secretly indoctrinating their children in weird lifestyles and things that go against their values. And they're indoctrinating them in secret. That's the whole thing about it, is the secrecy of it. Yeah. So the parents discover this, they have a right to be angry. And the perpetrators have a right to be the recipients of that anger if it's just verbal. So, for the FBI to come in, now they're being a political police.
Yeah. It seems that way.
To police what government employees are teaching children without the parents' knowledge. And this has a whole attitude that comes with it, is another subset of critical theory and cultural Marxism, and that is to separate children from the parents, divide the child against the parent, break up the nuclear family, and then replace the government as the family. So you're even hearing this now. You can't say that those are your children. They're all our children.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I've seen op-eds with that title.
Well, now the FBI is enforcing that.
Yeah.
Where does the law say that? It doesn't.
So let's touch on this cultural Marxism issue, because, of course, there's some moderate liberals who might see this, and this whole cultural Marxism thing isn't exactly some right-wing conspiracy theory. Anyone who's read the Communist Manifesto knows that Marx and Engels called for the dissolution of the family structure itself, but it actually goes a bit deeper than that, and you touch on the history of cultural Marxism before with some of Marx's earlier writings about 5 years before the manifesto was published. So could you just give us a rundown as to what cultural Marxism actually is, rather than how it's so often portrayed, and sort of where it started and what they want to do? What's their actual goals here?
Yeah, to deny the existence of cultural Marxism is to deny the existence of Marxism, because it's not anti-Marxist who said it first. It was Marx himself who said it first. Yeah. So before he wrote the Communist Manifesto, 5 years before, in 1843, he was writing about destroying culture of all kinds. In Germany, you had a unifying German state, which had previously been principality, so there was a little real German identity, even if they spoke the same language. Break all that up. Break up any duly constituted authority. Break up the Judeo-Christian ethic behind that authority. Break up the Greco-Roman traditions behind democracy and republicanism. Break it all up. They're oppressive. The principles are oppressive. The morals and the standards are oppressive, whether they're law or spiritual or anything else. They're all oppressive. The church is oppressive. The parents are oppressive. Fight against all of it. Tear it all apart. So that was his view. It was a nihilism, a nothingism to just destroy. Yeah. And then build whatever dictatorship that he defined, ultimately the dictatorship of the proletariat. But it was a dictatorship, and that's what he wanted to build by destroying everything first. Yeah. So that nihilism reemerged just before World War I, just before the Bolshevik Revolution. And then the Bolsheviks had a violent revolution, but then they had their own cultural revolution to follow that, to have this destruction of family, setting children against parents, parents against children, to inform to the secret police against one another. Subvert the church, subvert everything about society, and then make it all serve the interests of the party. So just over a century ago, in 1922, the Soviets were looking at how to expand their revolution to Europe and beyond. And they created in Moscow an institution that would later move to Germany and be called the Frankfurt Institute, the Frankfurt School, at Goethe University in the city of Frankfurt. And this was to take Marxism and to blend it with the sexual studies of Sigmund Freud, and so sexual psychology, and Marxify it. And now you're making revolution really edgy, really fun, really, naughty, really forbidden. And you mix that with drugs and drinking and the bohemian lifestyle, which was really popular at the time in the most decadent city of Europe, Berlin. And now you've got something to tear out the center of defeated post-World War I Germany, which was already demoralized. So tear it apart, polarize it. Take out all the moderate people, the monarchists, the liberals, the conservatives, even the moderate socialists. So it's just the communists fighting now the Hitlerists, the Nazis.
But they didn't succeed.
Hitler took power first.
Yeah, because part of what the Bolsheviks wanted to do was get Germany on their side, and that didn't happen.
No.
In fact, the Frankfurt School ended up in New York. We actually imported this problem, didn't we?
Well, this was the thing. These scholars and so-called intellectuals, and some real intellectuals, but of the stripe, they went to Switzerland or France or the UK for asylum, for shelter. And a few of them came to the United States, and then they brought more of them to the United States. And they negotiated with Columbia University, with the spouse of a Soviet intelligence agent as the negotiator, to transfer the Frankfurt School to Columbia University, which had the nation's premier teachers college, to do what? Teach the teachers.
Right. And then we got John Dewey and the National Education Administration and the others.
Right. So Dewey's out there with his experimental teaching methods, and you can think at the time we had a lot of immigration coming in, a lot of industrialization, you have electrification of the countryside. So people have more access to everything. They're looking for better ways to teach children. So most teachers out there are really sincere about wanting to do their jobs to take care of children and teach them. Somebody like John Dewey organizes them now from the top as a union. So you have to be a member of the teachers union. You pay dues to what? To John Dewey and his people, who are then what? Providing you with the best teaching methods being developed from New York. Yeah. Well, if you're in Iowa or Maine or someplace, you're going to think this is really neat. This is cutting edge stuff. It's affordable. Let's do it. Yeah. But what did Dewey do? I mean, he was a socialist. He was not a Communist Party member. But he went to the Soviet Union. He toured Stalin's educational facilities, and he wrote a 6-part series in the New Republic about how wonderful Stalin's education system was and how it should be replicated in the United States. The NEA has never renounced this.
No, of course not. They're probably still compromised. But, going on then, from the Frankfurt School is where we actually got critical theory. They're basically one and the same. But what we might say is the chief of the Frankfurt School, at least who's probably best remembered, was Herbert Marcuse, who goes off to California, and he picks up one of his students, Angela Davis. So I've done some research on Davis, of course, but what was her story and how has she played a role in what we now call wokeness?
Angela Davis emerged with the New Left in the 60s, part of the militant and violent Black liberation movement. So not the civil rights movement, that was nonviolent. It was the extremist Black liberation movement that identified with Fidel Castro and communist revolutionaries in Africa and so forth. So they wanted to overthrow our country by any means necessary, as Stokely Carmichael had said. She came up through that movement. She bought the shotgun that her friends used to murder a California judge.
Yeah.
And she got put in jail for that, got sprung. She was acquitted, even though she was still part of it. And what does she do then? She gets her credentials. And this is the thing, of course, in academia, you must have credentials, whether they're well-earned or worthwhile or not. You just have to have them. So, but she got her credentials in East Germany.
Yeah.
So she got her degree in East Germany, communist East Germany. That's where the Stasi first evaluated her, and some allege may have recruited her as an asset, if not a complete controlled agent. Nobody knows for sure. But her behavior certainly reflects this. She then came back to the United States. She got the Lenin Peace Prize from Brezhnev's Soviet government. Yeah. She came back to California, got now a lifetime position in the California State University system as Dr. Davis. So she got laundered from terrorist or terrorist facilitator now to scholar. Yeah. And then later became a political candidate running not for a far left Democrat Party or even a socialist party, but running twice in the Communist Party, which was a Soviet-controlled entity in the United States for running espionage operations and influence operations. So she was their candidate, which is pretty much proof that she had been recruited back when she was in East Germany.
Yeah. I've tried to find her dissertation from East Germany, and I can't do it. And more than that, if memory serves, she was only there for her PhD for a couple of years, I think 2 or 3. Which is unheard of to complete a PhD.
Let alone take the coursework.
Right.
Yeah, so it's just a credential.
Right. It doesn't ever.
No one knows what she really did.
Yeah, but she's still been influential. I mean, just a few years ago, going back to the universities, Georgia Tech, which is a total feeder school for the NSA, they often placed either first or second in the NSA's code-breaking competitions and so on. And Georgia Tech's DEI officers invited Angela Davis to give a talk, which is just, it's absurd, right? That this school that works so closely with some of our most sensitive technology and is a feeder school for the intelligence would hire these people that would invite her to come to campus and teach and lecture their students. It's just...
To what end?
Yeah. I mean, it really seems that the universities and then the intelligence community as a consequence has erected this fifth column that everyone can basically see. Only a few of us are acknowledging. But, so I noticed
and
that.
it began that way, too. If you look back at we didn't have a foreign intelligence service before World War II. Yeah. And even before Pearl Harbor, we started setting one up with the urging of the British. And we had to start from scratch. So General Bill Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, needed a lot of people, a lot of scholars, a lot of subject matter experts and linguists, and people who knew and had almost current information and context behind enemy lines. And he was hiring at a huge hiring spree, and he hired a lot of controlled Soviet agents, Soviet sympathizers, and Communist Party members to become chiefly analysts within the OSS. They were analyzing information to inform President Roosevelt on how to fight the war, but their goal was not merely to defeat Hitler. Their goal was to create a post-war political space for Stalin.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, among the OSS officers was Herbert Marcuse.
He was one of them.
Yeah.
And the CIA even has whitewashed him now.
Yeah.
They doesn't even mention that he was a Soviet asset, even though he openly was with the Comintern.
And then taught Angela Davis. He said she was his favorite
best student, favorite
Yep.
student. And the CIA now embraces him as one of its own.
Oh, yeah. Which is ridiculous. It's insane that we've got, I think that a lot of the public still has this image, to varying degrees, that these agencies are protecting the nation. But that doesn't appear to be the case if they've adopted, sanctified even, some of these figures that actually sought the country's destruction not all that long ago. So,
And they're a lot of they still view it as protecting the nation. It's just a different nation that they're protecting, a nation that doesn't exist yet.
Certainly not.
That they're trying to establish. And even at the CIA, for years they had a program with its own hashtag called Agents of Change, sometimes Secret Agents of Change. This was to change the culture of the CIA to be this rainbow DEI, whatever you want to call it, kind of culture. And if you didn't go along, you wouldn't get promoted.
Yeah.
You were viewed as toxic.
Yep.
You contributing to a nasty, unprofessional work environment. So if you're unprofessional, no promotion for you. So what promise do you have there? And if you look at who the CIA is recruiting, they're only looking for this kind of individuals where they go around recruiting to the college campuses, just pushing DEI weirdness.
No.
It's like the military. Who wants to join? What normal person would want to join the military if it's all going to be a freak show?
Only our agents of change.
Agents of change.
Yeah.
So the CIA as an institution has committed itself as what it calls one of its core missions to push DEI not only within the intelligence community, but as agents of change on the country.
Yeah. Which traditionally was considered improper. The CIA officers,
yeah.
they focused foreign. They did not operate inside the country. That is no longer the case.
Well, it's against the law for it to run covert operations inside the country, but they don't call it covert operations.
Well, I guess it's against the law unless they're running Soviet influence operations inside the country, right?
Well, it's like legally fluid environment, if they want to use fluidity as a term. It's like with the Constitution. It's not a living document.
No.
It's a foundational set of principles.
No.
So by calling it a living document, it's these same critical theorists who say, well, we're going to make the Constitution mean what we want it to mean.
Yeah.
That's not what it meant on our founding as a country. So it's some of them are actively working against the United States for the Russians or the Chinese or Hamas or whoever else. We've seen this. This has been public information. But most of the rank and file don't see it as anti-American at all. They think it's the new America. It's get with the program, boomer. This is where we're going.
Yeah. Well, just even some states now are in odds with the Constitution. And we've just seen recently that the state of Hawaii has stated that the spirit of aloha is grounds for restricting Second Amendment rights and basically the entire Constitution itself. But Hawaii has a special place in the story, if memory serves, because that was where Frank Marshall Davis took up residency, and he was the mentor of Obama. So, one of the things that's very clear from our data analysis that we've been conducting over the past couple of years is a lot of this started in the federal government with Obama's second term. When he got reelected in about 2011, of course, as most presidents do, he turned to domestic policy rather than foreign policy. They avoid foreign policy because it's easier. No one's paying attention as much. So when they can no longer be reelected, they focus on domestic policy. And it's just very clear in all of the data that we have that as soon as Obama took office again, right around 2012, all of a sudden goes up. So what is Obama's philosophy? I mean, you mentioned his love for some of the critical theorists, Niebuhr, for example, and of course Frank Marshall Davis as his mentor. But can you just explain Obama's philosophical views and the role that he himself played in what's going on now?
Obama's at his best when he speaks off script or on a hot mic, when his comments aren't carefully prepared, so he can give his glib, smiley comments to tell us how wonderful, not just his ideas are, but how wonderful he is. Where you look at his remarks that were not in the script, so he departs from them for a minute. That's when he says, I want to, in a few weeks, we're going to fundamentally transform America. I want to have a domestic security system that's equally as powerful as the military and equally as well funded. Little things like that. Those are very revealing. And then you have the orchestrated Obama, where he writes in his memoir about coming back from his madrasa in Indonesia, going to Hawaii. Here he is as a boy with a mom and no dad. And so his grandfather has a black friend with a white wife named Frank. And so the grandfather thought that young Barry would benefit from identifying with a black man with a white wife, because it was kind of like his own family. And Obama repeatedly identified this man only as Frank. Never said the man's full name. And it was Frank Marshall Davis. Frank Marshall Davis goes back to the old Chicago Communist Party. He was a Stalinist all of his life until Khrushchev said Stalin's bad. Then he became an anti-Stalinist or non-Stalinist. But he was always a committed party member. And what was that? That meant to overthrow the United States Constitution. By force if necessary, by subversion if necessary. It didn't matter, but at some point. So he mentored young Barack from about age 9 or 10 to when he went to college. Shaped him well enough so that years later, Barack Obama writes about him in his memoir very fondly. Well, why did he omit Frank's last name? He was hiding it while trying to tell his story. Well, he was hiding it for a reason. And then he meets through Chicago when he graduates college and goes to become a community organizer and gets in politics. And he meets Valerie Jarrett in Chicago, who introduces him to Michelle Robinson, who is becomes now ultimately First Lady Obama. But Valerie Jarrett's from an old communist family. And then Obama happened to mention several times he would hang out with Marxist professors as part of his social circle. And they would study Marxist writings as a way of picking up girls. And that one of his favorite writers was Herbert Marcuse, the old Comintern guy, who was the founder really of critical theory. So these are the people who shaped Barack Obama, and then who goes to mentor him as how to become a politician? Bernadine Dorn and Bill Ayers of the old Weather Underground fame, who are now laundered through an educational system to get an academic title and to teach, and now they're somehow respectable. And he hung out with them his entire career, political career, until he became president. This is not an accident.
No, I don't think it is either.
So then you get disciplined in that approach. You're going to want to have an inner circle that shares your views.
Right.
They'll reinforce you. They'll staff you. They'll execute what you want executed. They'll keep a code of silence with you. They won't leak against you. And that's precisely what he got.
Yeah. And by the time that Trump came into office, the bureaucracy was built up. And they did leak, and they did turn on him, and they did resign.
This is where the weaponization came in.
Yeah. And it became clear in those years that something had radically changed through Obama's presidency, especially with the intelligence community. But, we were talking a few months ago with Dr. John Gentry, who you cite in your book. And you talked earlier about what kind of crazy person would actually want to join the intelligence community. And so, it struck me personally because I had a background in national security and was going into this field. And when I got up here from my rural military college, I got to see it firsthand. And I remember this commercial, and you made mention of it, that the CIA put out, the Humans of CIA, and walking around. And it's all about me, 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 me. this particular one where this woman talks about how she's this cisgender millennial with anxiety disorder and can belt some song in Spanish, but her existence isn't a box checking exercise, just to be clear. It's just kind of the irony of all ironies. And of course, one of the things that struck me about that was that a Democratic politician named Alyssa Slotkin had got on Bill Maher's show and talked about what was going on with the CIA because she had served in the CIA. So where are the more moderate Democrats? Why have they not stood up to what is going on, the Obama administration and the radicals that were brought in? Because even her, she brought this up, saying that the service of an intelligence officer is supposed to be about something more than themselves. And now it's all identity politics. It's all subjective. We have employee resource groups and so on. But where are these moderate liberals? Why have they not stood up to the more radical elements of their party?
Or even the hardcore liberals aren't standing up. You don't even need to be there, because it's not the same as being woke. Liberal and woke are two different things.
Yeah.
And well, that's part of the problem, isn't it? It's the silence coming out of the whole intelligence community. This book, Big Intel, is from 40 years of not being inside the machine because I was never an employee.
Yeah.
But
you probably couldn't have got this published had you been an employee because it would have had to go through review. They wouldn't have let it.
No. Even though nothing in there is classified,
No.
But they're not coming out to talk about it because it's a fraternity. You don't break that fraternity.
No.
Now, I don't know how they call it fraternity because that's a gender-specific term. It's a binary term, fraternal. But whatever, it's a club. It's a society, and you don't talk against it, even if you're trying to make it better.
No.
So there are very few John Gentrys out there.
I was floored that he got that through his book, Neutering the CIA. Yeah. The fact that he got that through CIA's publication review it still shocks me.
It's so heavily footnoted, and it's really middle of the road when you look at it. It's not a screed of any kind.
No.
It's a straight, very analytical, like you'd expect from a good CIA analyst.
Yeah, and he is a good CIA analyst.
But the fact that somebody would even think that the agency would not allow publication, even though it's all open source and it's all footnoted, shows how bad it's become. They want to censor dissenting views from this. Yeah. So when you have people who've devoted their lives to the intelligence community, they see it being ruined before their eyes, and they still won't speak out about it. It shows that the nature, it's sort of wrought with consent, with tacit consent. There were people I talked to in before writing this book, and then when they found out I was writing the book, and then when I bounced ideas off the one writing the book, they said, please don't say anything that would ever hint that I talked to you, because all hell will come down on top of it.
Oh, yeah. I noticed this at George Mason University. I used to work there and closely with the Hayden Center, and they've blocked you on social media. They have actually blocked you. And one of the things that was so shocking to me about being up close with them was all of the things that we've discussed here. The fact that DEI and a lot of these ideologies began with our adversaries trying to influence us, trying to destabilize society. They refused to talk about it.
No.
One of the things that was so funny about the Hayden Center is they eventually brought up Yasha Monk to talk about identity politics and the problems, but they never brought up the issues with DEI. They never spoke out against the administration. They never spoke out against the dean, who basically oversees all of their grants, and it's quite shocking. And it was really disheartening to me as a student and an employee to watch some of these men who have supposedly sworn allegiance to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and they're not even willing to lift a pen against these people.
They won't allow a debate on it.
No.
They don't even have to speak out against it. In a university, you're supposed to debate things. No. Is this a good idea or is it bad? Yeah. Does it, in this case with the Hayden Center, does it help our intelligence community? Is diversity our strength, as the latest, war is peace buzzwords are having everyone believe? Or are there downsides to it that we need to be watchful of so that we can have the best of the best people in these jobs? Yeah. And Hayden leaned Republican
For years.
For years. And I'd met him a bunch of times. I interviewed him a few times. He seemed like a real straight shooting intelligence officer. And then something in him just switched. And then he brought in people like Michael Morell, who was behind this fake letter with the 50 of which Hayden signed, of that the Hunter Biden laptop had all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. Well, no. And they even said further in the letter, in their weasel words, which is what you find in a lot of analysis, we really don't know whether this is true or not. Yeah. And we're basing it on a USA Today article.
Yeah.
But they got their headline, and the headline was, so it was a phony letter that was carefully drafted at the request of a campaign person named Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State now, to write this phony letter with all these impressive signatures or impressive positions attached to all these names. Then 9 more of them hid behind anonymity, so there were more. Solely to create a headline in Politico 3 days before the Biden-Trump debate, so that Biden could cite that 51 intelligence officers say that story about the laptop is Russian disinformation. Well, they really didn't quite say it that way. They weaseled it, but that was their objective. So they were running a covert operation against the American public during an election.
Yeah, and so at the time I was at the Hayden Center, and at that time it wasn't sold that way. But in hindsight, and after all of these years, and some of the people watching this are like, well, they acknowledged in the letter that they weren't exactly sure and blah, blah, blah. But they knew what they were doing. They'd run this type of operation before. And I'll tell you, I won't say who, but there was a man on that letter who I knew, and I spoke with him about critical theory and some of the research I was doing. It was very clear, this is no-go. He did not want to talk to me about it. And he really liked me there at the Hayden Center, but he refused to discuss this at all with a student. It was forbidden. You could tell, right? And this was the culture that anyone who didn't sign their name, who was asked to, well, they were going to be blacklisted too. So
you're not in the club.
No, absolutely not.
You won't be given your sinecure after you leave government service. Nope. You won't be made a professor. You won't be getting big grants. You won't be put on corporate boards. You won't be able to become part of the intelligence industrial complex as a contractor. You won't be able to have a nicer lifestyle than you have now, and your colleagues will scorn you. So that's one of the reasons for the silence. This is a whole lifestyle issue involved. Yeah. If you look at the homes where a lot of these retired intelligence officials live, where they've become contractors, and some become contractors for foreign countries that aren't exactly friendly to us. Some help communist China. But they're using the titles that they got at taxpayer expense to advance their own personal lifestyles and living this fraternity and this politicized system that, by virtue of their titles, they must be right because they know the secrets.
Yeah. Even though that's often not true. They weren't on the ground. They weren't really the
no. And in fact, they weren't even intelligence officers who were signed that. They were some defense officials or something else. Or even if they were not experts in these areas. Yeah. But no intelligence officer would write an analytical product like that letter, because you would say from the outset, the Hillary Clinton political campaign has dropped a story, or in this case, this other piece has dropped. We have a low degree of confidence that this is Russian disinformation, but it might be. So let's check to see if it is. Yeah. That'll be fair.
And that was one of the things I noticed even back then with my more youthful, naive self, was this did not look like something that intelligence officers would write. It certainly wasn't how we were taught to write summaries of information ever. The change of tone and of style was shocking. And, on some case, there's some reason that I think naive students and just naive people will look at that and say, well, they were trying to communicate with the mass public. But again, we have to stress, they knew exactly what they were doing. This was not just some fluke that has been politicized. They knew. And I think Morell has even acknowledged the fact that he was trying to help the Biden campaign team.
And you had members of the Biden campaign team, like former CIA Director Brennan, who admitted over 2 years later, it really wasn't. He conceded what the critics had been saying all along. So it proves they've become hacks. But when you become like a general in the military or a senior intelligence official, even when you retire, you're still unofficially speaking for the community. You can't just go out and say things and do things. This was never, ever the custom in the United States.
Yeah.
You were either quiet or you were nuanced about it or understated about it, and you would not get involved in political campaigns because people would assume that their former agencies were behind what you were doing.
I think we actually have a mutual friend who's a general who doesn't vote to try and remain apolitical as much as he possibly can. So there are some good ones out there, but they're increasingly vanishingly few.
Yeah.
But to go back to some of the students, the young people who are interested in getting involved in the intelligence community in any regard, because of course it's not just political or science, international relations, foreign languages. I mean, the hard sciences too, material sciences, engineering, geospatial,
Mathematics.
Software mathematics. One of the great overlaps between the intelligence community and the university, the America's academic archipelago, is that almost anything, the agencies will tell you this, and it is true, almost anything that might prove useful to them. And so they hire people of all sorts, and that's true. So some of this serves as a warning to those younger people who are perhaps interested in going into the intelligence as to what has become of the agency and what needs to change.
And this is the big dilemma, because if our country is to have a future, we need the best intelligence services.
Yeah.
So we need the best people.
Yeah.
If the best people go in and they're wokeified, or they're just put under control of critical theorists, they're never going to meet their full potential, and they're never going to really serve their mission.
Yeah.
But if they don't go in and serve, the country will never have benefit of their talent and their knowledge.
Right.
So we're in a real dilemma.
Yeah. No, I've noticed that. I brought this up when we spoke with Dr. Gentry some months ago, and I had said that of some of the recently commissioned military officers who went to the intelligence side, some of the people that I know who went into the agencies officially got their foot in the door, a year onto the job, they all want to leave. They're so tired of the culture, they don't want to be a part of it anymore. And Dr. Gentry turned around and said, on the other side, he's heard the same thing. I mean, have you met young students or people like that who have shared those same grievances?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
But you know who doesn't allow wokeness? The Communist Chinese don't in
Yeah.
their own services. The Russians don't in their own services. Iran doesn't, and they're fine to see it inflicted on us, or maybe give an assist here and there, which you can see from some of the Maoist techniques being used in some of the indoctrination.
Yeah.
There looks like what might be a Chinese hand behind it, or at least Chinese inspiration behind it, communist Chinese inspiration.
Well, I remember that cartoon that the Chinese Communist Party put out, or at least their state-run TV network, that was promoting anti-racism, so-called. They were promoting that in the schools for the kids and whatnot. But the CCP had produced that video. So, yeah, the Chinese absolutely have a hand in it. And the NAS has tracked Confucius Institutes for a long time, and now Confucius classrooms as well, in the K through 12 level. But,
Well, this is where, the NAS has been so vital in this kind of work, because in documenting the Confucius Institutes as carefully as was done, this helped political and intelligence leaders in the Trump administration to recognize a problem, to see it clearly, to map out exactly where it was flourishing, and then to map out, hey, these universities are feeder universities to the National Security Agency and elsewhere in the intelligence community. So the NSA went down to some universities in Texas and said, if you keep your relations with the Confucius Institutes, we're going to discredit you as far as accepting people with your diplomas into the IC, into the community. And that's when a lot of the action took place to start to push Confucius Institutes out.
Yeah.
So it's that type of pressure. I mean, imagine some people are saying, well, they're just teaching linguistics and language and understanding Chinese culture, but they're doing it from a Communist Party approved perspective with Communist Party accredited personnel. And even the Americans in the program are all accredited by the Chinese Communist Party's Ministry of Education. And then you go to China under party supervision to get your linguistic skills to do what? To get hired by the CIA or the NSA? What are we doing importing that kind of thing? So we really have nowhere to go.
Yeah. But it's just interesting that not all that long ago, the intelligence community comes down on the Texas universities and says, enough is enough.
Yeah.
We're not doing this. This is a counterintelligence threat. But now today we have, well, okay, you're promoting DEI. Great. That's not a problem whatsoever.
That's different because it's not seen as a foreign intelligence threat.
Yeah, not yet, anyway.
Not yet. But when you have it, and this was part of the purpose of, it wasn't the original purpose of Big Intel, actually. I was looking at how did they become woke, meaning since Obama.
Yeah.
And that's when I started finding, well, this has roots. And why was this person this way? Well, it's because this person was a protege of so-and-so. And I'm not relying on secondary sources. I'm going back to the original sources where FBI Director Comey wrote all about his devotion to Reinhold Niebuhr, who was not a communist, but who was part of the Frankfurt School solar system.
Obama had a love for Niebuhr too, right?
Obama did too. And when Obama's people carefully vet those to take positions in the late first term and then in a second term, they're looking for somebody. Oh, this guy, he's a Niebuhr man. Let's bring him on because Obama said Niebuhr was his favorite philosopher too. So you have this ideological chain of custody. You trace it back and trace it back and trace it back, person to person, year to year, until you get to 1922 in Moscow at the Marx Engels Institute, where the leaders of the brand new Communist International, which the Soviets had set up to control all communist parties in the world for a worldwide revolution. And the head of the Cheka secret police, Felix Dzerzhinsky, the head of the KGB, were all in that meeting to set up what would become the Frankfurt School, which would develop critical theory. So if you look at it that way, it's the FBI's job by statute to defend the United States against foreign propaganda, of which the Frankfurt School was. It developed a life of its own, but it was still originating as foreign propaganda. So this is a century-old Soviet active measure that the founders knew would not be complete during their lifetimes. They were looking that far ahead. We don't think that way as Americans. And they've succeeded. And they've succeeded in penetrating our whole society and then undermining our internal defenses that were built to defend us against it.
But Herbert Hoover, and you talk a lot about Hoover's tenure as FBI director, he tried to warn people about this, about the communist threat, and wasn't taken as seriously as he probably should have been.
J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah.
I'm
sorry.
That's all right. Yeah. He was a really interesting guy, and he wasn't even supposed to be part of the book until I'm tracing this back. Didn't the CIA know about this, that they were being infiltrated? What about the FBI? Of course, I knew J. Edgar Hoover was a solid anti-communist, solid pro-American founding principles. I'd read his works before. But then I went back and made a study of the actual testimony he had prepared before Congress as early as 1920. Warning Congress, warning the public. So from 1920 up until his death in 1972, he was warning about this. So they're infiltrating our government agencies, they're infiltrating our churches, they're infiltrating our schools, they're infiltrating our unions and Hollywood and music and art and literature and everything else. We have to be vigilant about this.
Yeah.
Now, he had bipartisan support throughout his entire career. And from the 1950s up until just before he died, he was one of the most trusted men in America. Gallup poll after Gallup poll showed that. So people not listening, yeah, it's hard to listen to very stern, gruff warnings by somebody like J. Edgar Hoover. You'll listen and you believe it. But a lot of these communists and cultural Marxists are really nice people. They can be anyway. They have a nice face to them, but they can be really ruthless and nasty.
Oh, yeah.
But they can be kind. They're helpful. Their whole existence is to bring more people in, to convince more people. So you're going to persuade through kindness. Yeah. You're going to build loyalties through doing favors, for getting people scholarships, for getting people placed in internships and in staff positions, getting them elected, getting their script reviewed by the right producers, making sure the Screen Actors Guild is adequately run by friends. to produce movies that have the messages that, the desired messages, and so on all the way down the line. So Hoover was warning about this, but then people think, well, these are nice people. These are clergy. They're not my union local leaders, but they're the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Come on, they represent millions of American workers. But it was a communist-run union. So the American Federation of Labor, which was an anti-communist union. So we hate these guys. We're going to get them out. They took over the CIO, purged all the communists, and then became, from the Democratic left, liberal side, a big bulwark against fighting communist expansion and subversion. Until later on, those generations left the scene and were replaced by people who are friendly to the bad causes. But Hoover warned us all his life.
Yeah.
And there was bipartisan support for these warnings.
So we've gone from an FBI that warned everybody about this to an FBI about communist infiltration of the education system and the schools and the churches. We went from that FBI to now an FBI that is recruiting from those compromised education systems and is actually targeting the few churches that haven't been touched. You mentioned in your book this memo where traditional Catholics were labeled as potential extremist threats. There was a SWAT team raid on a pro-life activist's house. He was later acquitted of the bogus charges that the FBI leveled against him. The jury called out the FBI for its politicization in that case. But
and they're not isolated incidents. That's the issue. You had there was a special agent at the Jacksonville, Florida field office named Steve Friend. He was working on hunting down child molesters and child traffickers in America. He was pulled off those cases to become part of a SWAT team to raid the houses of Florida citizens who had protested in Washington at the Capitol on January 6th. They weren't even suspected of felonies. They were just suspected of unlawful parading or whatever. But you take people off of hunting down child molesters to doing this in the Bureau. So he said, this is nonsense. This is crazy. And then people who voluntarily told the prosecutors, hey, just tell me when, I'll show up for the judge for my hearing. They swatted them anyway and raided their homes. It's becoming a rite of passage for FBI agents to smash in the houses of American citizens who haven't been convicted of anything and who haven't even been accused of serious crimes based on their political expression.
Yeah. We should touch on January 6th because I remember watching it live. I was just a few miles away watching it on the news, and the framing of it's really striking after all this time because it was labeled as this insurrection, which is funny because the people who have been accused of insurrection have a lot of guns, and they didn't bring them with them to insurrect the government. So it's probably not fair to say it was an insurrection.
It was not an insurrection.
So one of the last things that I want to touch on is the great irony here is all of this began as radical leftist influence operations with the backing of the Soviet Union and some of their agents from the Frankfurt School and other Western radicals. And so for all of this talk about conservatives being engaged in insurrection and being duped by Russian disinformation and Russian meddling, the irony, of course, is that the liberals are actually the ones who have fallen prey to Soviet disinformation and Soviet meddling and have failed to acknowledge that. And, just the other day, Tucker Carlson was in Moscow interviewing Putin. I'm sure you've seen the interview. It's come out recently. But Tucker Carlson, and in fact, he had the top quote on your book. So you, unlike many of the phonies in academia now, you are an actual expert on counterintelligence and disinformation. So on some hand, it's absolutely absurd to say that the conservatives are the ones falling for Russian disinformation because the liberals are the ones who have definitely fallen for the Russian disinformation. But the concern is still there. So how do we mitigate the risk of the Kremlin's ongoing Russian disinformation campaigns, and as well as mitigate the concerns of some of the more moderate liberals who agree with us on DEI, what needs to change in the intelligence community, but are also concerned about the fact that conservatives might be cozying up to Putin a little too much. So
here's the funny thing that, as you just pointed out, the believers in and conveyors of Soviet propaganda, Soviet disinformation, the shock troops for Soviet active measures, are the ones accusing, pointing the fingers today, even though you can document, especially among the older ones who were active in the Soviet times, that they signed on to these Soviet active measures campaigns. And even those who were not there at the time are still spreading residual Soviet active measures and disinformation that's out there now as so-called scholarship or primary sources or whatever else. So they're eager to point the finger. But at the same time, we have to understand that all of us are targets of Russian, communist Chinese, and other propaganda and disinformation. So on the one hand, the left has generally been the transmission belt for this. But increasingly, what the Russians and the Chinese regime want to do is to keep splitting our society, turning us against each other, causing us to distrust not just our institutions, but to distrust everyone around us, distrust our friends. Yeah. And so this is where disinformation and using people on the right as channels for disinformation is something that we do have to be concerned about. We can't dismiss it. We have to map it. First, but we have to map it accurately. Is it just because we disagree on certain strategy or tactics concerning whether or not to help Ukraine, and if so, how to do it in ways that benefit us? Does that make somebody a Putin tool because he has a different idea? That's what you're hearing a lot of now, and you're hearing it from people with access to classified information when what they're saying is a lie. But at the same time, we can't dismiss such allegations that some of us might be targeted. And if we're targeted, we need to be conscious of the fact that we might be targeted. That's what the old FBI used to do. If there was a politician who was spouting some Soviet active measures theme, the FBI would approach him, say a member of Congress, and say, "Sir, we have detected a Soviet active measures theme. We'd like to give you a defensive briefing." Or your staff has been compromised. Or we picked up intelligence that the Soviets are targeting you. It's called a defensive briefing. It's not adversarial. It's just to say, hey, and it's not saying you'd better change your ways or else. It's just to let them know what's happening. And this is standard procedure. It has been for decades. They're not doing that anymore. So with the Trump targeting, the Trump collusion narrative, they never went to Trump and said, "Mr. Trump, there's a Russian campaign to target you." They never did that. No. They never did it with his staff. So you can see right there, it's a phony narrative if they never even tried to approach the individual and say, "Watch out." And most of the time that individual is going to say, "Thank you. Thank you for the information. I'll be very happy." Or, "Get lost, get out of my business," but then they might temper what they're doing. So we're all targets, some of us more than others, but nobody's immune.
Well, with that, I believe we've reached our allotted time. So a special thank you to the members of the National Association of Scholars who've made this interview possible. If you're not a member, please consider joining up. And a special thank you to Dr. Waller for joining with us today.
Mason, it's been a good time, and we just barely scratched the surface.
Yeah, we did indeed. There's a lot more to talk about, but perhaps again in the future.
Great.
Yeah.